Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone who's joining us, depending on where you're logging in from. My name is Thin Lei Win, and I'm a journalist specializing in food systems, including as lead reporter for the Food Systems Newsroom of Lighthouse Reports. And I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion on behalf of IPES-Food. Now, this webinar has a subtitle in addition to the new Geopolitics of Food, and the subtitle says, Trade Wars, Hunger, and the Case for Cooperative Self-Reliance. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground over the next 90 minutes. But before we start, let me just go through a few housekeeping messages. So this webinar is in English, and like I said, it'll last an hour and a half. We have set aside some time for Q&A, so if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. And if you have a question, could we also ask you to identify yourself and your affiliation? However, please do use the chat box to let us know who you are, which organization you belong to, and where you are joining us from. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be shared after the event, and it will also be put online on IPES-Food's YouTube page. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, we'll get to the meat of the program, which is about a new geopolitics of food that is taking shape. I think we could all agree that the global food systems are facing major headwinds. But it's not just the sweeping tariffs that has been announced or the expectation that trade wars will follow. It is also the uncertainty, the lack of predictability and foresight around these decisions, which make it really difficult to come up with coping strategies. But of course, these trade issues are just the latest in a long line of challenges to global food systems. For example, we have a global population where 1 in 11 people didn't have enough food to eat in 2023. In 2024, 35 million people were on the verge of starvation. Conflicts and use of use of food as a weapon of war are major factors in this case. At the same time, we also have 1 in 3 people who couldn't afford nutritious diets, and 16% of adults who are obese, because the foods that we're eating are not nutritious, and those that are, for a vast majority of people, these are out of reach because prices have been on a historical high. Now, there are 2 other major issues facing food systems. One more recent one is the dismantling of the USAID, which is dramatically affecting the global aid infrastructure. But it's not just the US, right? Other industrialized nations like the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany have cut or are planning to cut development aid as well. Then there's the matter of food systems being a key driver of both biodiversity and climate crises. And yet, policies to tackle these crises are either non-existent, not ambitious enough, or are being rolled back as we speak. So the tariffs and the trade wars and all these challenges have very real potential to deepen hunger and inequality. Now, IPES-Food is monitoring global trade flows and food markets and plans to do more on this topic in the future. But a lot of the coverage around tariffs and trade wars have tended to focus on what's happening to American consumers and farmers. And we want to take a global view here. How is this playing out in different parts of the world? Where are the key challenges and needs? And what should we be concerned about? But we also don't want to just focus on the doom and the gloom, because in this moment of upheaval, there may be opportunities now to establish better food systems. And if that's the case, how can we do this? So these are the things that we're going to be discussing today with a panel of top-notch food systems experts and thinkers. First, we're going to start with a presentation by Jennifer Clapp to set the scene. Now, many of you already know Jennifer, but I'm going to briefly introduce her anyway. Now, Jennifer is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo, Canada. She's a member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub, and of course, a member of the IPES-Food panel. Now, Jennifer's presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with 3 additional experts, also from IPES-Food. We have Elisabetta Recine, nutritionist, public health expert, and professor. Now, Betta is also the former president of Brazilian National Food and Nutrition Security Council, which is advising the Brazilian government on its zero hunger strategy. Next, we have Jomo Kwame, who's an economist, senior advisor to the Kazana Research Institute, a fellow of the Academy of Science in Malaysia, and an emeritus professor. And last but definitely not the least, we have Belay, co-founder and general coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, who's very much involved in agroecology, conservation, and indigenous livelihood issues. But first, Jennifer is going to start us off with setting the scene. Jennifer?
Thanks very much, Thin, and I will share my screen for a brief presentation. I just want to check that you can see my screen.
Yes,
Awesome.
we can. Thank you.
Excellent. So, yes, thank you very much, and delighted to be here today. As Thin mentioned, I'm coming to you today from Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, and happy to be discussing these really important topics. And my presentation will be a really broad overview and hopefully set the stage for the panel discussion that comes. So obviously the session is on the new geopolitics of food. So I want to talk first about what is the new geopolitics of food? And what we're referring to here are major shifts in world politics in terms of alliances and in terms of tensions on both the economic and security axes. So there's really big shifts among what we consider the sort of great powers, but it's having huge implications across the world. And there are multiple catalysts for these big shifts in geopolitics today. I'll just quickly go over what they are. Thin mentioned some of them, but basically we're seeing military conflicts, the outbreak of wars, territory grabs, and the lack of political will to seriously address them. And more recently, with Trump 2.0, who is determined to break norms and cause chaos in the name of putting America first. But this is having huge economic repercussions around the world. We're also seeing change beyond just the imposition of tariffs and sparking trade wars, but also huge cuts, as Thin mentioned, to international aid and humanitarian agencies. And this is coupled with a weakening of global institutions. And because there are so many fronts on which we're seeing shifts, I think it's useful to think about it in these different kind of big categories of shifts that are going on in the background, and maybe to drill down a little bit to talk about what's happening under each of these dimensions, though recognizing that in 10 minutes, we don't have time to cover all of them in each category. But first, just to say on the military conflict front, what we're basically seeing are these ongoing wars, such as we're seeing in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, etc., where there's no clear path to conclusion to these wars. And as Thin mentioned, there's also an increasing use of food as a weapon of war without being condemned by the global community. It's just we're breaking these norms globally that is leading to really difficult situations in many parts of the world. And we know when Thin mentioned the hunger numbers, many of those people experiencing hunger are in these war hotspots. But in terms of the trade and economic dimensions, what we're seeing is that Trump, obviously, with his on-again, off-again tariffs, but he's imposed tariffs in a way that has affected every country. He's got that blanket 10% tariffs on everyone, and then specific tariffs targeted for countries that he feels are not treating the US fairly. However, these are very punitive measures on developing countries, whereas previously we had a global norm of special and differential treatment for the poorest countries, and that's just been completely gutted. We've also seen trade being rerouted. So, for example, China is now turning away from purchasing agricultural goods from the US and is looking to South America for its soy imports. We're seeing declining demand from the US for goods from the global South, leading to job losses, export revenue losses. Plus, we're seeing the US and China are now both warning developing countries not to strike trade deals with the other that would benefit their, benefit each other, and this would upset their trade dimensions with each other. And we're also seeing weakening growth in many poor countries, along with weak currencies, because as the US stops purchasing from those countries, that affects their economies and that affects their currencies. Though interestingly, this is in the backdrop, the US currency is also sliding, and that's a purposeful measure on the part of the US to improve the competitiveness of the US economy in terms of making it cheaper for investors. So there's a lot going on the trade front and the economic chaos that's followed. In addition, as mentioned, the aid cuts, and I would say realignments here. The US, followed by other countries like the UK, Germany, et cetera, as Thin mentioned, they're slashing aid budgets, and we're seeing realignments where other countries like China and Russia are stepping in. China's providing aid and loans to many poor countries, including in food systems. And we're seeing food aid being cut and canceled by the US, with the result that aid, shipments of in-kind food aid are rotting on ships and in warehouses. And there have been big budget cuts to the food agencies, the World Food Program, FAO, et cetera. And on top of this, then we're seeing weak institutions where the UN is struggling to respond to the various crises as they crop up. And this is coupled with a loss of relevance of the WTO. I mean, the WTO is one of these bodies that, was able to uphold these norms of liberalized trade and had enforcement powers, and that's been deeply weakened. Many countries are just ignoring the WTO right now. So even if those rules were trying to stand up for fair principles, they're being flouted. And the food agencies of the Rome food agencies of the UN are also vastly under-resourced in this situation. So we've got many things going on many fronts, and I'll just quickly talk about the impacts, because I'll talk about it quickly because we're going to come back to these in the panel discussion. But this outer ring, and I didn't want to draw straight lines from what's going on here, but this outer ring are the impacts that we're seeing or keeping an eye out for, because there's a great concern that these will be the consequences. Obviously, volatile food prices, and we should add in here input prices as well. So agricultural input prices and food prices, we're seeing increased volatility and a rise. Many economists are expecting inflation to follow, including in food, and this is going to be a huge, huge problem. Also, when there's economic chaos, and we learned this during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we learned it during the Russian aggression against Ukraine, is that when there's economic chaos, corporations often step in and profiteer in these circumstances. We're also seeing these climbing import bills on the part of food import dependent developing countries. So they're a bigger portion of their budgets and foreign exchange are going to have, when they're dependent on food imports, it's going to have to go towards that as food prices rise and as corporations increase their profits. And this is contributing to a growing debt burden in the global south. This is a huge issue and problem. This is this problem of debt, and it's just made way worse when countries are having to, the currencies are weakening, yet then they're having to put many more resources towards repaying debts. And there's concern that global interest rates might rise as inflation takes off, and this could make the debt burden even worse, which affects food security in profound ways. There are also ecological costs that we have to be aware of. For example, as China is increasingly sourcing commodity crops like soy from South America, this can lead to deforestation and increased chemical use. And all of this contributes to rising hunger and inequality in the world. And I recognize I'm probably missing some of these knock-on effects, but these are the big ones that we're reading and hearing about in the media and as analysts are pointing to. And so we are keeping an eye out on all of these fronts to see what is happening. Now, in terms of how developing countries are responding, I mean, we're basically seeing a huge loss of trust, which is spurring responses from many countries, but the precise direction of those responses is not yet clear. So we're in a moment where there's a lot of change, a lot of discussion, and this is the moment we feel we need to step in and help to discuss these opportunities for change. But I'll just quickly outline, we're seeing many countries calling for increased domestic food production, which is interesting and important and improving self-reliance. However, at the same time, there is this huge split in discourses where we're seeing a number of countries saying they want to increase domestic food production, but they want to then ramp up industrial production, use AI-driven models of industrial agriculture, versus, on the other hand, others promoting agroecology. So it's not clear, like the direction. We're seeing this sentiment towards increased food production, but not clear how. We're also seeing an increased sentiment towards diversification of trade partners. And this is important. Many countries recognize they can't produce all their own food. They're going to have to engage in some trade, but maybe rely less on the US for trade, but also for assistance. However, some countries are also very wary of becoming too dependent on China, who's very willing to step in and take that role, or other countries like Russia. And we're also seeing many countries defending measures that they have had in place to protect small-scale producers. So, for example, in India, there are policies for trading grain and for protecting dairy farmers, et cetera. Those measures are really important. And it's not just in developing countries. In Canada as well, we have supply management in our dairy sector, and we're trying to stand up for it. But at the same time, these measures are often in current discourses being dismissed by critics who lump them in with tariffs as being misguided economic policy. So while there's this sentiment to increase production, diversify trade, and protect smallholder producers, at the same time, there are big shift narratives pushing against that in different ways. So it's an interesting moment that we are in. So just to close here, I want to talk about, how do we meet this moment? How do we engage in this chaos that we're experiencing and these big geopolitical shifts to push for more sustainable, resilient, and self-reliant food systems? And here we're calling it cooperative food self-reliance, or cooperative food resilience and self-reliance. And the idea here is to engage in and promote discourses about working cooperatively with like-minded states and communities to foster greater resilience and self-reliance strategies. So in other words, not saying every state for themselves in an autarkic kind of way, but rather working cooperatively with other like-minded states to trade where trade is necessary, but also to help build self-reliance. This is something that could and probably should be done within global institutions like the WTO, but that's been, it's been difficult in the last 20, 25 years, but I think this is something we have to bring forward. Also, it's important to collaborate across jurisdictions to support agroecological transitions to boost domestic food production, rather than sort of falling completely in the AI industrial model. Instead, we need to support agroecology, but this needs to be done, again, cooperatively and across jurisdictions. There's also a need to build infrastructure to support territorial food markets. So rather than relying on these big corporate value chains, instead supporting territoriality in terms of food trade. And IPES-Food did a recent report on territorial markets last year, and maybe we can pop that information into the chat. And finally, what this cooperative self-reliance and resilience means is fostering fair and cooperative international trade and aid relationships that are grounded in solidarity principles. So again, this whole idea is to, open the conversation for global cooperation on building self-reliance and more resilient food systems, not advocating a kind of autarky or complete self-sufficiency, but doing this while other states are trying to bolster their own food systems and insulate themselves from the chaos going on in the global political economy. So with that, I will stop. Hopefully I didn't go over 10 minutes, and I will stop sharing my screen, but thank you then.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna, for giving us this big picture view on what's happening. And we're going to be expanding on quite a few things that you mentioned in the panel discussion. And then we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so discussing them. And of course, so I want to bring in our three other speakers now. And the first very obvious questions that I have is to look at regional trends and impacts. For example, what are the impacts of this latest crisis, in your region, and how does it look from where you are? And I'm going to ask our speakers to keep their answers to a maximum of 3 minutes. And Betta, can I actually start with you from the Brazil, South American perspective on what the impacts have been?
Yeah, thank you. I think that it will be an example of everything that Jennifer just said. But before that, I would like to celebrate the number of people that is on the section. It means the importance, of course, of this topic. Well, as you know, Brazil, like many other countries, has experienced periods of rising inflation, especially in more recent years. And one of the main drivers of inflation has been food prices. These increases are linked to a combination of factors: extreme weather events, market conditions, international demand, and the rising cost of important inputs. And I think that what we are discussing now can be a very important determinant of this condition in the future. Well, in the middle of 2024, food inflation in Brazil became particularly significant. And at the same time, a relative deregulated market allow for continued export of essential food items like rice, meat, commodities in general, and a domestic price surged. In addition, trade measures and the new US administration, despite some back and forth in policy, have created additional pressure by opening new opportunities for Brazilian exports, particularly to China. This scenario is not unique to Brazil because, of course, many Latin American countries are also commodity exporters. As a result, we may see an increase in exports of grains, meat, and even fruits, but this especially brings internal challenges. Sorry, I think there is a flu coming in my direction and my voice is really weak, but sorry about that. I will try to do my best. So what are the main internal challenges that we are facing or in now and in the medium term? A potential drop in domestic supply for certain food products, leading to higher prices, political pressures on the government to increase public financing for commodity production. Third, we can see a expansion of farmland into ecological sensitive areas, such as in Amazon and the Cerrado, increasing environmental stress on potential threat biomes, which may harm water resources, biodiversity, and also exacerbate social inequalities. Some recent actions support these concerns. For example, the Brazilian Congress recently approved a new criterion for environmental license. This proposal is strongly backed by the agribusiness lobby, shifts the responsibility away from environment agencies and allow landowners to self-declare compliance. The approve has sparked a strong opposition from civil society and smallholder farming movements who are now using who are now urging the president to vet this law. So I think there's all the aspects that Jennifer raised is now on the table of the not only on the Brazilian government, but Brazilian society, but also many other countries in the region. Of course, there are political and economic differences among these countries, like if you see Argentina, there is a different approach of the scene, but we can also, in different scales, you can see and thinking about what can happen in Uruguay, for example. So I think that all the threats we are facing or beginning to face this kind of threats, but we can also thinking in another dimension. For example, all the dismantle of the sanitary regulations that is potential happen in US and the consequences all around the globe. For example, we are now in trying to control the avian fever in Brazil. That is a consequence of our conditions and our possibilities to export, for example, chickens and their products. So I think we are just facing the new steps of actually a food war. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Betta. And I'm so sorry you're coming down with something. I hope it will be temporary. We could hear you fine. So, thank you. And we're going to be talking about that rerouting of trade that you mentioned later on as well. But Jomo, can I come to you next? So I know that Asia is a massive continent and it's very, very hard to generalize, but maybe you could talk about the specifics of East Asia, if there are any notable trends or reactions or impacts that you think are worth highlighting.
Thank you very much, Thin. I think following on from Jennifer's presentation and also Elisabetta's, I think we have a situation where many of these problems are quite common. If I may begin with the ecological or the environmental, I think we have a continued steady deterioration of the world situation. Heat is a major problem, and planetary heating continues to worsen conditions all over the world. It challenges water resources especially, but we also see other factors contributing to the worsening of water supplies all over the world, including in East Asia. I would also like to emphasize the deteriorating world economic situation. We have had basically very slow economic growth, if not recessions, during the last 2 decades, especially since the global financial crisis. And there has not been a significant improvement for any sustained period. Of course, there was a slight upturn after the worst of the pandemic was over, and so on. The other thing to emphasize is that many of these problems are actually the result of deliberate decisions. You correctly mentioned what is called Trump 2.0, the tariffs and so on, but this is not really new. We have seen rather than cooperation in the recent period, we have seen increasing weaponization of various things, including trade and technology, and including food. And this leads me to my third point, that we have undermining of the various institutions which we had in the past, which might have contributed to offsetting some of the worst of all this. The UN system has been rendered very, very weak. The latest report on the crisis, on food crisis in the world, emphasizes how steadily situation has deteriorated over recent years, especially. It's important for us to remember that economic growth has faltered for quite some time, but especially in the last dozen years or so, and especially as it applies to food crisis. So we've had, but it's not as if there is a shortage of food being produced. There is enough food being produced, as many people remind us, but there is not. But the problem is less and less people can afford food. So the problem is not the question of sufficient food supplies, but rather the affordability of food, and especially, as Jennifer reminded us, the availability of nutritious food. I noticed that there are a number of people who are following this discussion right now, who are thinking about nutrition issues and dietary issues, and these are very, very important. But the problems, of course, cannot be generalized, because these needs are met in different ways in different parts of the world. Now, yet another specific issue right now is the whole question of the weaponization of economic relations, including the weaponization of trade relations. And we have seen how we have seen in the so-called response to the Ukraine war, the invasion of Ukraine, and especially in the case of Gaza, we have seen how the food has been blatantly weaponized with very, very little protest. So we have seen a deterioration of the ethics, the very ethics of human existence itself, and especially as it involves food, has been very, very, very severely undermined in recent times. So I think we have a very sad situation right now, but I think I've exceeded my 3 minutes, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jomo. But I think some of what you've said are definitely, maybe people already know this, but definitely bear repeating the weaponization of food, both Jennifer and you spoke about it, and the fact that it's not the availability at this point in time that is the problem, but it's the accessibility and the affordability, which are also other pillars of food security that sometimes we tend to forget, right? We tend to just think about the production and the productivity without actually thinking about the other aspects. Million, can I come to you next? What are you seeing in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah, as you have rightly said about Asia, Africa is also difficult to generalize, even neighboring countries, Ethiopia and Kenya, you see a different context. I was in the Congo Basin, in Congo Brazzaville, and the condition there is much more different than the rest of the continent. So it is different, but the continent, as you know, is already under stress. 2 out of 3 African countries are in debt distress, and that makes them vulnerable for so many things. And there are a number of continuous neo-colonial agenda coming in so many ways, and that's also part of the biggest stress. So I was shocked when I was in Congo Brazzaville, the amount of food that is imported from outside, over 80%. So now I've been told that the price of food items is increasing. And this is a common thing across Africa. The price of agrochemicals is increasing. Unfortunately, we are continuously driven to a past dependence, our farmers. There are still so many farmers who are not farming out without using agrochemicals, but a number of them are using agrochemicals, and there's already a past dependency there, and any price fluctuations there is a crisis. What is happening quite now is also the OPO of 91, and this is an agreement which has originated in Europe. So our countries are, when they are signing agreements with European countries and other actors, they are asked to sign this draconian seed regulation, which is called OPO of 91, which is not allowing farmers to save and share and use their own seed. So this kind of influence are coming. What I've observed also in countries where there are now a lot of forest, there is what they call green colonialism. Basically, large tracts of land under carbon trading are being owned by big companies, and people cannot do what they were doing for thousands of years. So it is a continuing and increasing mechanism. People are coming with money. You see, at the beginning I said the debt crisis is a real and a present crisis. Countries need money for a number of social services, and this carbon trading comes, with a lot of promises. We haven't seen achieving anything yet, but they come with a lot of money, and that's very much attractive to government. So the green colonialism is happening. Trade barriers, via sustainability standards, policy capture. What's happening is also in an increasing way is this policy capture through some actors in Africa, like the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, seed policies, biosafety policies, policies are on agrochemicals, policies related to land. They are all changing. They are all being influenced by these actors, by outside actors. Even the biggest agricultural policy for Africa, which is called the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program, is hugely influenced by outside actors. And the direction of the going for that document is to invite big corporations to feed Africa. So yeah, in so many ways we are experiencing it. I think it will get It will get much more uglier as more and more countries are falling into the Trump way of doing things. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's very clear from all of your answers is that, you know, some of the inequalities that already exist, some of the problems that already exist in food systems are just being exacerbated by all the tariffs and the trade wars, and the concern is that we're moving in the wrong direction. Jennifer, I want to bring you into the conversation for the next round of questions. So in addition to the tariffs, what other new geopolitics dynamics that are you seeing? And, you know, are you seeing also, you know, who are the biggest winners and losers, or who could be the possible biggest winners and losers? Again, if you could keep your answer to 3 minutes, that'd be great.
Thanks, Sen, and I'll try to be very brief. But yeah, as mentioned in my presentation, there are multiple factors beyond just the tariffs that are leading to these geopolitical shifts. And just to stress the ones that are really important for food systems. I mean, conflicts are hunger hotspots, and we're seeing a lack of progress here. And as you mentioned, we were already experiencing increasing food insecurity in the world for the last 5 years. We've been through multiple crises, and these conflicts are just making matters worse in certain parts of the world. On the aid front, I think what's really interesting and important for us to recognize is, as the U.S. withdraws, countries like China and other states like the Gulf states are stepping in with assistance, especially looking towards sub-Saharan Africa. China has already had its what they call the food Silk Road, where they're providing all kinds of assistance, including digital agricultural assistance to, you know, AI kind of assistance for agriculture into places like sub-Saharan Africa. But many of these projects, they're loans. They're not necessarily just, you know, free assistance. And so that's increasing debt burdens, and many countries across sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are about to have loans come, you know, China come asking for its payments back. And this is deeply problematic when you layer that with the US and its weaker currency. So the US is trying to weaken its own currency to encourage investment into the US because the dollar is cheap. But lower values of the US dollar are typically correlated with higher world food prices because food commodities are denominated in US dollars. So others then are trying to maintain their income by raising the price of food. And so who's the losers? I think the poorest countries are the losers in all of these scenarios, especially with these shifts and the ways in which they're increasing poor countries' debt burdens and their loss of foreign exchange earnings from their typical exports to places like the US, which is pulling back, right? There might be some winners on the margins where, for example, if countries decide to stop buying from the US, other developing countries might be able to step in and provide some of those food items to big importers. But on the whole, the poorest countries are, I would say, the losers. And we just have to be aware of these aid shifts in particular and the sort of the philosophy behind what those new donors, for example, China or maybe Russia, you know, what do they want to see in these countries? And it could be just more industrial agriculture. So we have to really be aware and participate in the dialogue and discourse around what kind of future we want to see. But I know that's a later question, so I'll just...
Yeah, we'll come to that later. But Jomo, I want to bring you in because you've written a fair bit on this, specifically on the role of China in these broader, geopolitical maneuvering. So if you could maybe follow on from Jennifer on what you're seeing in that would be great.
Yeah, Jennifer has correctly raised the whole issue of what drives some of these interventions. And some of these interventions are very helpful and very necessary, but they're also driven by the conventional criteria of commercial viability in the medium term. And this is problematic. As China itself knows from its own experience, it has made a lot of sacrifices to ensure a high degree of food self-reliance, partly because it has been, subjected to a lot of antagonism ever since 1949. So we have a situation where China itself has not really done as much as one would like to see in terms of enabling other countries to emulate the Chinese experience. But we have a larger problem, and that is the commercial considerations basically impinge on everybody and impinge on all countries. And it's very difficult, for example, if alternative use of land is going to yield cash crops, which are going to yield higher incomes, to encourage or to ensure that that land is actually deployed for ensuring food, especially for people who cannot afford to pay very much for that food. So it is a problem. And so the fundamental problem has to be seen in relation to inequality. Now, China is also very uniquely placed in the world, that we have a situation where China is the largest producer of some items, but very few, relatively few, but is the largest buyer of some items. And this has, for example, been extremely important in enabling it to address the Trump tariffs. If we look, for example, at what has happened in recent times, during Trump 1.0, some of the Trump's tariffs at that time were countered by a Chinese reduction of imports. Chinese reduction of imports from the U.S. And let's not forget, the U.S. is the single largest food exporter in the world. So not the inability, for example, there isn't much of a market for chicken feet. China is the single largest consumer of chicken feet. And so, it basically, they couldn't find any alternative buyers. And more recently, we have seen Brazil, for example, emerging as the supplier of the alternative supplier of soya and to the U.S. So it has basically this ability to have such a strong what the economists would call a monopolistic power has enabled China to say no. So it is not surprising to us that that China was able to stare down Trump, and Trump basically had to revise his tariff strategy vis-a-vis China. Unfortunately, it doesn't help the rest of us, because President Trump's approach is to isolate countries. And for most countries in the world, which are relatively small, do not have much market power, they're not able to resist what the U.S. wants. And so, for example, in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations tried to deal with the tariffs collectively. Not that they have a common position as such, but they wanted to deal with it collectively. You have strength in numbers. Washington refused to do so. So we can see how important it is to be able to divide and rule. So an old imperial strategy is still very relevant today, even in the on questions of food. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Jomo, I just want to quickly follow up on what you said, particularly the relationship between China and Brazil, right? Particularly on soy and corn, which, like you said, China is increasingly sourcing it from Latin America. What are the, you mentioned briefly the fact that, China is able to do it because it's so big, but what is the signaling about China's place in this new geopolitics of food? Do you see it playing a bigger role? And are there any other costs to this trade rerouting to other countries?
It's difficult to see that because it's not there isn't enough attention. There's so much going on with the tariffs and related issues that there hasn't been all that much attention to food issues. But I think when you consider the larger context of economic stagnation for almost 2 decades now, when you growing inequality, which has been exacerbated, especially in the recent period. And President Trump, by his cabinet appointments alone, remind us of the gross inequality which we have in the US, if not in much of the world. So we are reminded of this consistently, but it is not simply a question of one of these issues in isolation.
Great, thank you, Jomo. Betta, it'd be great to hear your insights from the other side, Brazil's role in this new geopolitics of food.
Thank you, Thin. Well, I think that we need to see the number of economic sectors went with President Lula to China a few weeks ago. So I think that's a very good example. And the number of agreements that they sign. The Brazilian agribusiness is projecting even great, especially the agribusiness, not only then, but especially the agribusiness sector here in Brazil, are projecting even great volumes of exports to different markets, but especially to China. There is a point of view not only in the agribusiness sector, but also in important sectors of the Brazilian government, that the global instability can offer a positive impact on the national economy, because offers an opportunity for the country to strengthen its position as a key global food supplier. And if these expectations are confirmed, it's likely that there will be even greater environment pressure to guarantee this production in an intensive model that is independent of chemical inputs and fossil fuels. No? And of other aspects like genetically modified organisms, pesticides, etc. Therefore, expanding agriculture exports to China has raised concerns about even bigger deforestation, land use changes, sustainability in Brazil impact both not only environment and ecological stability, but also social conditions and social equity. And it's raising several environment concerns, for example, loss of biodiversity, climate change contributions, displacement of indigenous and traditional communities, and a sustainable land clearing practice. There is also a concern about deepening dependence on a single market, which reduces the country's ability to organize itself in face of international political and economic fluctuations, and even retaliatory actions. So I think that we are facing a very challenging moment in the short, medium, and long terms, because the consequences of this instability, it's not, I think we will not be able to fix in months and even years, depending on what will happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betta. And when you were talking about, the dependence on a single country, I was reminded of an IPES-Food report that came out soon after Russia invaded Ukraine, right? Where that was slightly different, where there's double dependence on the imports, right? Countries so much relying on imports, on a small number of countries, and how that's really having an impact on their food insecurity. And also, a couple of years ago at Lighthouse Reports, we did an investigation into sort of like pig farms in Spain because of the swine flu. China was starting to import a lot more from Spain, and the impact on environment as well as the social impacts were really quite shocking. Now, we've talked quite a lot about the problems and the challenges, so I want to talk next about the possibility of a new era of food aid that could perhaps be better than the old system. Million, you're still here, right? And you've written about this recently, where you think that could be an opportunity in Africa. So can you just take us through your thinking in 2 to 3 minutes? Thank you.
Yeah, as you know, as you have said when you were opening this session, a number of countries are kind of reducing their support, even the European Union, but the main one was USAID. The withdrawal of support from USAID in so many African countries has sent shockwaves, especially in some sectors, in health sectors specifically. And also they were supporting a number of internally displaced people, IDPs, and they were hugely affected and the support also to some of the NGOs has shocked those NGOs, and a lot of them are out of jobs, and those working on human rights issues are very much affected. So my heart goes out to all of these people, who depended on the income from USAID and who are suffering. But on the other side, I think on the food system and agriculture and whatever side, for so many years, USAID has dominated the policy space. It's my personal experience. I participated in some of the regional harmonization meetings on biosafety, for example. Almost all of them were organized and supported by the USAID. And it has led in my country, for example, Ethiopia, in the watering down of the biosafety laws. And since then, Ethiopia has started prospecting on GMOs. That's a direct result of the intervention of USAID. And I also know that the USAID, through its support, so through AGRA, was weakening so many of the seed laws, biosafety laws, and also to some extent the national agricultural strategies of some countries. So that is a huge, huge impact. And the kind of agriculture that they were promoting is also chemical based. So that has impacted us quite a lot. So even the recently concluded the development of a 10-year strategy, CADAP, as I said, it was also, I mean, the request of, or through the support of USAID, and through the indirect work of USAID, we couldn't put agroecology in the CADAP document. So this long-lasting policy level influence were there by USAID. So the demise of USAID was welcome in that extent, even though it had impacted a number of countries. So I think, as I will say later, it has also cleared so many spaces. But we're not 100% sure. We're being vigilant, because there are other philanthrocapitalists filling in the space that USAID is leaving. And also some countries also can come in, some European countries who have interest in opening the market for their own businesses would fill in the USAID spaces. So we are not saying that, oh, okay, USAID is gone, everything is fine. That's not the mood yet. So if you want me, I can speak, but maybe when I get a chance later, I will explain how we are going to use this space.
Perfect. Yes, we'll come back to you on that. Jennifer, I just want to quickly ask whether you have any reflections on what Milian just said.
Yeah, I think Milian raises some great points. I mean, with the removal of supports by USAID, of course, it's having huge implications for health and food security for those who are directly depending on it. But he also raises correctly that the USAID, the US government's aid, had a particular perspective on what their vision of agricultural transformation and food assistance looks like. And it's not an agroecological vision. And so, there could be creating new openings with the withdrawal of the US. But at the same time, I mentioned already, China has already, trying to influence in Africa, for example, on agricultural assistance. It's trying to get its own digital AI platforms for agriculture into the African context in a competition with the other kinds of big tech companies that are also operating in Africa. So that's an interesting dynamic. We'll see what happens there. And also just to note that on food aid, with the withdrawal of the US, we could easily see Russia stepping in. We saw that when the Russia invasion of Ukraine, where Russia was providing very transactional kinds of food assistance to African countries, like, we'll give you a discount if you support us in global forums on this invasion question. And so very much Russia was using food aid in very similar ways to what the US did in the past, using it as a political tool, very transactional. So I guess, as Milian said, it remains to be seen how these shifts in dynamics play out. But the withdrawal of the US certainly opens up opportunities, both opportunities for local actors to fill that space, but it's going to be competing with these other foreign actors who are trying to get in, and it remains to be seen how that plays out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, just a very quick last round of questions before we open up a Q&A, and I realize that there's already quite a lot of questions, so we do want to take as many of them as possible. But let's, final question, continuing with the theme of looking ahead into the future and seeing some opportunities for change. So, if you could talk about if we can use this latest upheaval to reimagine our food systems, and how and where can we do that? So Betta, can I start with you, followed by Milian, and then Jennifer, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Thank you. Betta, you're still on mute. Yeah. Oh, no, you're still on mute. Milian,
now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Well, we are mainly dealing with, let's say, one aspect of this broader landscape, mainly the bad ones, no? But I think that we can also raise some positive situations and initiatives that can push to a transformation. Now, for example, here in Brazil, we have important social movements and civil society organizations that are really working toward transforming food systems in the direction of a just transition based on the principles mainly of the food sovereignty and the right to adequate food. And these groups have been actively engaged both inside and outside the government to secure funding, public budget, and public policies. For example, we have recently approved a new national plan for agroecology and organic production, as well a national food supply plan based on short supply chains, territorial markets. And we are expanding market access through public procurement and other mechanisms to support family farm, production of indigenous peoples, and traditional communities. And also, every year, the government approves a plan to finance agricultural production. And we are, and when I say we are, I'm saying about social movements, civil society organization, and part of the Brazilian government. We are fighting for expanding public budget allocation to family farm production, ensure technical assistance, and agroecology transition. And one aspect that I think that is key is social participation. That is one of the driving forces of this resistance. Ensure representative democratic governance that is protected from conflict of interest is key. In real terms, the gap in public investment between agribusiness and a model that is sustainable in the different perspectives is still vast. However, considering the country trajectory, we can say that some progress has been made. But it's also important to emphasize that none of these advances are guaranteed, are sustainable. There must be a constant process of preventing setbacks. And I think that is our greatest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Betta. Milian? You're still on mute as well. Sorry, could you? Yes.
Yeah, you hear me now. Yes, in 10 years ago in 2013, we asked ourselves in Africa, does agroecology work in Africa? And can agroecology feed Africa? So what we started to do is collect cases from all over Africa. We still continue doing that. And now, gladly, a number of universities over all over Africa, and from other continents are also doing research and also gathering, collecting information on agroecology. So it's very, very clear now that agroecology increases productivity, increases income, builds resilience to the system. It's a best methodology to adapt for the climate crisis that we are having, and even for mitigation, for both adaptation and mitigation. It increases biodiversity on farm and out of farm. And geopolitically, we're talking about self-sufficiency now, self-control, self-sufficiency. So farmers can be self-sufficient. They can eat healthy and sustainable food, culturally appropriate food. That is proven. That we can see that. I sometimes, over weekends I go around and visit a number of farms. It is possible, but it is not supported because it doesn't bring money to business, to outside actors. So it's not supported even by governments, and everybody talks about increasing productivity only. And also, as I speak, the Kenyan government has an agroecology strategy. The Ugandan government is on the verge of having a strategy. The Tanzanian government has a strategy. Ethiopian government is on the verge of strategy. Central African the same. Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Western Africa, Togo, Senegal. So all over African countries are having an agroecology strategy, and a number of research centers and universities are producing students or graduates who are capable of doing agroecology on ground, and farmers are endorsing it. It does not mean going back, it's going forward because it is science-based. It's a cutting-edge science. There are a number of things that are done on the farm which were not being done before, and we are using depending on our own seed. And again, we are not rejecting science. We are not rejecting technologies. Moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Midian, and thanks for emphasizing that, the idea that agroecology is rejecting science, which is not the case.
No.
Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks then. And indeed, I would say in crisis, we can always find opportunities. So for, responding to the situation, and agreed with Million about the need for these domestic shifts and programs to promote agroecological futures. But I would stress too that I think we need to be careful not to sort of say every state for itself. This is not about this crisis moment is not, I think, a moment where states should be closing off from everyone else and just sort of looking inward. It needs to be situated in a sort of what I would call cooperative relationships with like-minded states. So with other countries that embed the kinds of trade relationships, for example, that include the kind of norms that we've been fighting for decades about special and differential treatment for developing countries, special treatment for protection of the livelihoods of small-scale producers, and pushing back collectively against the idea that the global food trade has to be this huge trade of, controlled by just a few giant corporations trading commodity ingredients like soy and wheat, et cetera, and seeing them as ingredients that go into processed foods, for example. Instead, what we need are these cooperative trade relationships to support food diversity, to support nutrition, and to see trade as a supplement to increase domestic food production and, along agroecological lines. And that cooperation among states can happen to promote agroecology, to promote this more solidarity-focused kind of trade. I think that's the kind of vision that we need to be thinking about in this moment of flux. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. And I think that's a great segue into the Q&A. We're going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so just trying to respond to as many questions as possible. We already have quite a lot coming in. So I'm going to take 4 at a time, and then I'm going to throw it back to the panelists. If it is not directly addressed to you, just feel free to see which ones, you think you'd like to answer. But let's try and answer as many of them as possible. But let's try and also keep it as brief as possible so we can do at least 2 rounds of questions. So the first question is, what do these trends mean for international disparities around labor and resources, especially for the global south? There's another question also asking, how is climate change interacting with these geopolitical shifts, and what would be the impact on food security? And third question is, what concrete steps can governments in the global south take to strengthen their local food sovereignty? I think there were some examples that both Betta and Million just now gave of what's happening in Brazil and Ethiopia and Kenya, but it would be great if you have any specific tips as well. Are there historical or current examples we can learn from? And the fourth one, how can trade rules and the global trade system be adapted and reformed to support local cooperative food systems and strengthen local markets? But Jennifer, perhaps that one is definitely for you, how to improve. So, what does the trends mean for international disparities around labor resources? How is climate affecting these shifts? The concrete steps the governments in the global south can take, and how to adapt trade rules and the global trade system to achieve the kind of cooperative self-reliance that Jennifer, that you would just mention. Who wants to go first? Or would you wait for me to call on you? Jennifer, do you want to start with the trade, and then perhaps Betta, Million, and Jomo can pick ones as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Thin. And I have a few things to say about a couple of the other questions too. But in terms of the global trading system, I think that's something we have to have a big, think and discussion about. And I know IPES-Food is working on this, as are some other groups. The question is, do we need a whole new set of global trade rules? Are these trade rules just for like-minded states that would embed the kinds of norms that civil society and developing countries have been arguing for the past 30 years when it comes to agriculture? Or can the WTO be reformed in ways that would better embed those norms, and then the states that don't want to participate, maybe they step away? I mean, they've already stepped away. So I guess it's still an open question of whether the WTO is itself a reformable or salvageable institution for this to happen. But I would say that what needs to happen is the embedding of the norms of special and differential treatment for developing countries, rules that allow countries to have policies that specifically protect their sensitive and important industries, especially when they matter for livelihoods, when they matter for environmental sustainability. There are plenty of these kinds of programs around the world, and the spread of trade liberalization via the WTO and its excessive liberalization, as pushed by the US and other actors in particular, has tried to chip away all of those specific programs that are meant to protect the livelihoods of small-scale producers that are doing more environmental and socially equitable kinds of production. So that's like one thing that I think needs to happen, but it's a big agenda. We need to think about it more. The climate change question, I'll just say briefly, I think is really interesting, because some of these big shifts that we're seeing in geopolitics, like between the US and it's got its sights on Greenland, it's got its sights on Canada. I know we're talking about the global south, but the US making those moves is about climate change. It's about the melting of the Arctic and it being an important military site. So as the US is doing these kinds of big geopolitical maneuvers, and it's intensifying its rivalry with China over the Arctic, like this is having implications around the world, and that includes implications for food systems in the global south. And just quickly on labor, I would say it's an important question, because even if it's not agricultural labor that's losing jobs, what we're seeing with the impact of these tariffs is that the exports of some of the poorest countries in the world are being basically seeing the demand for their products from the US at least drop away, and that's leading to job losses. And when people lose their livelihoods, they have they don't have the income they need to purchase food. And so it has these impacts on food systems. Anyway, I've talked too much. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jomo, can I ask you for some of your reflections and thoughts on these questions?
Certainly, thank you. I think on the last point Jennifer made, I think we have a situation where not only in the US, but in many other parts of the world, we find that immigrant labor, often temporary labor, living in very, very precarious positions, are the ones who are involved in food production. This is how food costs are partly kept down. And this is, I think, is very important. It's a very complex issue, not easily remediable, but I think that's important. If I can go back to the whole question of the global trading system, let's face it, it has never been equitable. And from the outset, the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995 was deliberately kept out of the United Nations system. Okay, so you had to have a multilateral system, but you kept it out of the UN system, so it wouldn't be subject to the norms, the ethics of which inspired the establishment of the UN system in the first place. This is, I think, something very important. So now we have a situation where when the system no longer serves the most powerful interests, and I'm specifically referring to the US, it has been the US which has undermined the ability of that system to function. If we think, for example, it was under President Barack Obama who refused to agree to the appointment of judges for the appellate dispute settlement mechanisms, and so the WTO couldn't function. Now, part of this has been made possible by the collaboration of within the global North. But now we have a situation where President Trump has declared war on everybody else. It's not just the global South. And this, I think, opens up a huge opportunity where the global North no longer will see it to be in its interest to continue to collaborate with the US, because the US is only accepting them not on equal terms, but on subordinate terms. So if that break takes place, and there are already very, very minor indications that will happen, that has happened in Europe, but if it happens, then we have a possibility where Europe may well move to a position at least equidistant, and we might have the possibility of pressure coming from Europe itself to allow multilateralism to work, and we have a much more effective functioning of the multilateral system generally, especially the UN-led part, but even the WTO. The WTO is amazingly silent during this whole period. I mean, everything in the Marrakesh Declaration is being violated as we speak. But has the WTO come out? No. The last decision of the WTO was to reappoint a director general before she was due to be reappointed, and to declare that they're going to do things not on trade, but on investment agreements, which is not even in their mandate. So we have a situation where you have mission creep or whatever you might want to call it, but we have also, as a consequence of this, a blatant display of the abuse of these institutions. Let's face it, these institutions largely serve the interests of the global North, and they are not going to walk away and destroy them completely. So it's precisely because of that it's important to make to recognize this and to take the struggles within the UN system, within the multilateral system, and to push for many of these issues. If I can conclude on one other issue, and that's the whole question of agroecology, linking agroecology to actual ecological conditions in different parts of the world, including the global South, is crucial. The conditions, for example, in arid grasslands in Africa are quite different from the conditions in rain irrigated places. We have very, very serious problems. In Vietnam, for example, which is the third largest rice exporter in the world, Vietnam now has 10 provinces at least 10 provinces where seawater has come into the rice fields. The same thing is happening in Bangladesh, especially in the Sundarbans. So we have a situation where these are urgent problems. The amount of plastic which human beings are consuming through marine animals which are being consumed, all those are huge problems. And so we linking the whole question of agroecology to food safety as well as nutrition, as was emphasized earlier, I think are very important if we are going to use this opportunity to move the needle going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Jomo. Million, especially because Jomo ended on an agroecology note, I wanted to ask if you wanted to answer any of those questions or respond to them. Yeah.
To take on the climate, I think the climate is a crisis, as you know. So any situation which exasperates the precarious situation that our farmers find themselves in would add to the crisis that the climate is causing. So yes, it is you know, for example, what does a weakening of the dollar means, you know, for our people, for our urban people, for our farmers? What does that mean? We need to answer those questions. So yes, climate is a crisis. Any crisis added to that would exacerbate that crisis. That's obvious. So there is a question: what concrete steps can we take? I think that's a very, very important question. I think the most important concrete step that we can take is actually believing in promoting, recognizing, and using our local wisdom. You know, there is already a wisdom, a local wisdom with our people. For thousands of years, people have lived using their wisdom in every seed, in every agricultural field, in every plant, in every food that we eat. There is a local wisdom. Our people have faced so many upheavals in the past, so we have a collected wisdom. I think we need to do that, and the food sovereignty agenda should be a main policy agenda for African governments. I think they mention food sovereignty again and again, but sometimes we don't even know what they mean by food sovereignty. Is it producing agrochemicals in our own continent, food sovereignty? So there's some confusion there, but food sovereignty means eating culturally appropriate food and caring for the environment. So we need to redirect our investments also to our own, to the development of agroecological practices. We have a useful nation, I mean, a useful continent. So between production and consumption, there's so many things to do in agroecological entrepreneurship. So we need to explore that. Territorial markets, you know, the International Panel of Sustainability of Food, IPES-Food, and AFSA also produced a number of reports on territorial markets. These are very, very critical for food sovereignty. These are, you know, the signs of our sovereignty, our resilience. Actually, they are very small markets, close to people, economically important, socially important, environmentally important. So we need to focus on these markets also, instead of focusing on outside markets. So yeah, there are so many things to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Million. Very, very specific, better.
Thank you, Thin. I'd like to make some comments on two aspects of some of the questions. One, about the whole of food reserves. I think that recover the capacity of the governments to establish food reserves is key, because it's one of the dimensions of the food sovereignty. And for many years and decades, government just give up to has this whole on the food system. So I think that we need to recover this. It's not easy. And I think that one of the best ways to do that is not only to think about national food reserves, but even in regional food reserves, that we can establish something like what Jennifer was saying about the need to go to the direction of a more cooperative and resilient dynamics. I think that we have huge challenges to have this kind of values recovered in government, but also in society. But I think that we need to do that. And the other point is about if we can imagine that ecological perspective and way of production can be a main way of production of food in medium and long terms. I think that we need to think about another report of IPES. It's the report that presents a perspective of a long food movement, that we have some principles, and if we go to these principles, we can see that we are every day making choice about one aspect, one way or other. And we need to recover our capacity to mainly and first to give visibility of thousands experiences that are already living in others' food system model. The network of agroecological communities, the way that communities are trade or are cooperating to give, to expand access and offer of health foods. And also, I think we need to reduce the gap between three main movements that are now in the world: the environment movement, the right to food movement, or something like that, and also to have more fair tax, not only about food, but all the fiscal and tribute way. No? So I think that's the point that I can add at this point. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And yeah, I think particularly the three movements that you mentioned, I think that's so important if we continue in silos. I'm going to take another round, but I'm going to ask all of you to keep your answers very, very short, because we do want to take it and then we want to wrap this webinar up. So next 4 questions. This one is for Jennifer or Millian. You've mentioned this already, so maybe either of you should take it. And that's about what mechanism are the agro-tech titans using to tighten their grip on global food systems, and how can we overcome it? And how do we also navigate the space of power relations with the rise of private corporate aid, right? What would you say are the implications of weakening UN institutions and increasing fragmentation of global fora for the future of food systems? The third is around the weaponization of aid. Why is it being allowed? And is, could more be done to tackle this? And the last one is, how can we build true resilience in the poor segment of countries that are affected by conflict and crises, like Lebanon in the Middle East was cited as an example, without remaining heavily dependent on imports? So 4 very important questions, but I'm going to ask you to keep it super short. Jennifer, again, can I ask you to come first, because you have just written a book on agri-tech titans. So maybe you can talk about that mechanisms very briefly.
Yes, very briefly. The book's over 400 pages, so I have to be really brief. But I appreciate the question, because the agrotech titans, the big agricultural input companies, are all investing now in not just genetic engineering kind of tech, but also digital and AI kinds of tech. And they are tightening their grip on food systems via a number of mechanisms. One is simply through the dominance of the technology and their use of intellectual property right protection to advance their kinds of market power. And they're creating technological lock-ins that make it difficult for farmers to distance themselves from this kind of digital approach. But added on top of that is their use of the political levers of power to shape all kinds of stuff, including, aid regimes. And they're working closely with governments to advance their technologies, especially in developing countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think this is important for us to recognize that it's this concentration and power of these firms needs to be addressed alongside everything else we've been talking about. So that would be antitrust kinds of policies that would rein in that kind of power. And some of those strategies were discussed in a recent IPES-Food report, Who's Tipping the Scales, and also in my book. But I'm happy to put some things in the chat and stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Million, do you want to go next, especially around navigating this private corporate aid and how to respond to agro-tech titans? You're still on mute.
As you have rightly said, I think Jennifer was the right person to respond because she wrote a book about it. But the way they dominate our country is very easy to see. Money, they come from money. Hugely challenged continent in terms of money, as I said, because of the international financial mechanisms. We're very much weakened. And they push policy, they push dependency, and now the green imperialism, the neocolonialism. But the last question about how do poor countries in conflict can build the resilience, I think it's very sad. I think the most important thing is to remove that source of conflict. I think that assault has to stop somehow. It's very difficult to do any kind of agricultural activity when you are bombed every time. But I think whatever the condition of the situation is, I think that my last fall will be on agroecology. Basically, it's depending on, doing agriculture based on what you have in your hand, it's not depending on outside actors. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Jomo and then Betta.
Yes, I would, well, I presume this might be the concluding remarks as well. And I'd just like to emphasize.
We have one final question to end all, but that one is very brief, but please go ahead, Jomo.
Okay. I think this crisis, to use an old hackneyed term, is something we shouldn't go to waste. A lot of people are suffering because of this, but a lot of this suffering is actually the culmination of early increase in suffering for many people in the world. And if we do not seize this opportunity, which President Trump has presented to the world, to make a change, and I think so. For this purpose, I think it is really crucial to focus on the primary, to focus on the major things which unite us, and to focus on those things to try to seize this opportunity to strengthen the multilateral system, to strengthen humanity, human morality, ethics, and its manifestation within international relations. So that I would see as crucial, and in all areas, including in the area of food systems, as well as overcoming food crisis.
Thank you, Jomo. Betta?
Thank you. I would like to very brief comment about how and why we are still facing, and also not only facing, but an increased use of food as a weapon. I think that we need to think about the quality of the information that people in general are having access. And when we say about food as a weapon, we need also to think that thinking globally, very few people know about what's happening in the world. Sorry, but this is the truth, because the media is very specific about which kind of information will be delivered, and also country in governments in general, in a way, they are not facing this as a problem, because hunger is being used like a weapon historically. So we need to raise our awareness, not only inside our bubble, but have different sources and dynamics to spread this kind of word, and to pressure governments to be more active to end this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Betta. I realize that we are running already a little bit over, but if you could all just bear with me just for 1 or 2 more minutes, because I think there's a question that would be really nice to end this webinar with, just because we have talked a lot about the problems and the challenges. But I think this is a great question to end with. And it says, despite these powerful forces and vested interests, what gives you each reason to be hopeful? What keeps you going as the context get harder? What are working? So if you could keep it very, very short on why are you still doing what you do despite all those challenges? I think that would be great to hear. Jomo, do you want to go first?
Yes, I think the interconnection between food problems, food issues, and general human well-being is something which has been understated. But I think there's a great deal of evidence, medical evidence, there's a great deal of health evidence, and also the fact that, there are now widespread problems. The epidemiologists remind us of huge problems among intergenerational problems. And part of the problem, of course, is food. And I think the potential for popular mobilization around food issues is tremendous. And if we connected with that, I think the possibility of raising greater awareness on these kinds of issues, as well as how to address them. But for the time being, I wish there were moral leaders who would be able to focus on these issues, including leaders of different faiths and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Betta, what keeps you going despite all the challenges and difficulties?
Well, otherwise it would be impossible to live in this planet. So I think it is a commitment. But we have here in Brazil a thinking that was made by Paulo Freire. That is a very important educator. And he said that we need to have active hope that leads us to be together and to enhance our creativity, and not only in ideas, but put this in practice. We have a lot of billions and millions of good experiences. We need to enhance our capacity to network this and be more strong and powerful to put our demands and our capacity to change the status. Thank you. And thank you for this opportunity of this session.
Thanks, Betta. Milian has to jump off because he has another event, but Jennifer, can I give you the last word?
Sure, and I totally agree with the sentiments from Betta and Jomo about what keeps us going every day. But I just would say, as someone who, as a scholar, I'm kind of obsessed with all the bad things that are going on. But my hope is that understanding the dynamics behind what is leading to all these problems helps us forge pathways to solutions. And what gives me hope is that there are scholars out there doing research on examples of change, and that's super important. And we need to combine that with greater understanding of the dynamics that are causing the problems, and bring these strands of scholarship together to forge that future pathway to more sustainable, resilient, and cooperative food systems. So that's what wakes me up every day and gets me going. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much to everyone for this very rich, insightful, and wide-ranging discussion. So I'm not even going to try and summarize it because it's impossible. But can we give a virtual round of applause to all of our speakers for all of the insights and their time? Thank you so much. And thank you to the attendees as well for joining us and for staying, even though we've run over a little bit. Have a great rest of the morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you again, and goodbye.